Oh, well, Mini David was, I think, a really happy kid. I was really close to my older sister, Ellie. We were just about, a little over a year apart. Um, yeah, I mean, my parents were both working lawyers, but very present parents. And I would describe myself as I was very happy, very hyperactive, very physical, what they would probably, probably diagnose me with like ADD today, but I was uh, like uncontrollable energy and enthusiasm, I guess. So yeah, uh, I would say in a nutshell that was mini David.
And born in New York, when did you move to LA?
Yeah, born in Queens, New York. When I was about 2 years old, my parents, who were native New Yorkers, born and raised Brooklyn and Queens, they they had the courage to follow their hearts and leave all of their very close family, their parents, their aunts and uncles, all my grandparents, my great aunts and uncles, and my aunts and uncles. We left everyone and moved to Los Angeles, where they were pursuing opportunities as young lawyers. Um, Luckily, I would go back many times, I think around twice a year, if at least, to see all those relatives who played a big part in our lives growing up. So,
Excellent. So Nick, Leeds, I think, in the 80s is where you start. What's Mini Nick story?
Mini Nick, gosh, I think I like David's description of probably would have been diagnosed with ADD. Possibly I might have as well. I think I was probably like a bit much sometimes. I was really into magic from a very young age, from when I was about 4 years old. And so, I would bother family and friends to, pick a card and show them pretty naff tricks. And I think so. I was probably possibly a little bit precocious in that respect, but a very happy child. I knew from quite a young age that I really enjoyed making people laugh, whether I was sort of genuinely funny or whether they were just sort of humoring me, I think is much to be debated. But yeah, I went to very normal primary school and secondary school in Leeds. My mum and dad, my mum, they're both retired now, but my mum was a GP. It's quite funny because she was the doctor to some of my friends. In fact, my best friend from home, she was their family doctor, which is always quite amusing. And my dad had a few jobs when we were growing up, but he sort of settled in sort of like legal profession and was a solicitor for a good while he's now retired as well. But yeah, I was I guess I didn't know that I was kind of going to go into comedy or acting at the time, but I definitely had a passion for performing, and I guess maybe slightly being the center of attention. And yeah, music was quite a big part of my life when I was growing up as well. I played piano and violin, and yeah, but I have very, very fond memories. And obviously I haven't been back home for a while because of the pandemic, but I love going back to Leeds, and yeah, very, very fond memories.
And it's interesting that you both had lawyers as in the parental sort of setup. And David, I mean, the sense of social justice that came through them, I think, was very important to you.
Yeah, still is. It was really formative growing up. My parents were activists and progressives, and a lot of early memories on picket lines with them, and seeing feminist theater that my mom was in. And
Bless.
yeah, I was thinking about this recently in a conversation with a friend of mine. But I was born just 2 years after the murder of these three civil rights workers, Schwerner, Cheney, and Goodman, two of whom were young New York Jews, looked a lot like me. So and they were my parents' age, when I was born. So I grew up with this very, very hyper awareness, not just of the Holocaust, but of the very present reality of being Jewish in America, and anti-Semitism, and that I think, when you grow up with that kind of awareness that you are other, and that your life is literally at stake or in jeopardy in different parts of your own country, in your own backyard, I think it informs your worldview in a huge way. So that idea of being, of seeing any kind of injustice with any person of color or any kind of discrimination was really profound as a young person and kind of carried through. So
I know seeing live performance can often be a big breakthrough moment for people who go on to become performers themselves. And David, I think for you, being taken to the theatre to see, was it Ian McKellen at 13?
Yeah. Well,
Where was that?
Well, my parents had a love of theater, and every year we would, on one of our, or both our trips back east to see family, we would make a point to see as many plays and shows as possible. I remember a couple of trips we would see like 5 shows within a 6-day trip. So I was always going to theater, but my parents took me to see Ian McKellen's one-man acting Shakespeare in Westwood, in like one of the UCLA small theaters in Westwood. And I was just, I was 13 years old, and I was completely mesmerized. And it was, Nick talks about magic. I also was a fan of magic growing up as a kid. And the magic that Ian McKellen, like the magic trick that he did of transforming himself without any props or costume changes into 25 of the greatest Shakespeare roles written, men, women of different, sizes, shapes. I was absolutely awestruck. And I thought, I have to do that magic trick. I have to learn how to do that. So yeah, I was really bitten by the bug quite early.
And Nick, I was wondering with you, one, there was a huge sort of, theatre live performing scene in all those great old theatres around, Leeds and Yorkshire. But also magic, I think, had a real growth. There were all those people like kind of Penn and Teller and David Blaine, who were kind of quite huge celebrities by the 90s. What were you watching on stage?
Yeah, definitely. I think, magic sort of had a real kind of golden age, I guess, kind of going through the late 80s with the Paul Daniels Magic Show, and then, completely with the slightly more modern stuff, or modern at that time, with the street magic of David Blaine and some of the stuff that was coming through from the States, like Penn and Teller, the David Copperfield specials and so on. In terms of like live magic, I mean, I saw a lot of live stuff. Yeah, the West Yorkshire Playhouse. I remember seeing magic shows at the Grand and the Alhambra in Bradford. I think there was a real, there was still, I guess, a lot of performers who had, I suppose, cut their teeth at the working men's clubs in the sort of 70s and sort of kind of going into the 80s, who had a real kind of stock in trade kind of act, but who would frequently, do all the pantos up north and, or, have their own shows, and with some international supporting acts. And so I got to see a lot of stuff through similar to Schwim. My parents didn't hold back in terms of, we would be taken to as many things as I guess we could afford at the time. I remember seeing such a mixture of things as well, from musicals to Shakespeare to opera to magic shows. And I would always sort of take something, or try and take something away from all of them. But getting to see, I remember seeing Paul Daniels a few times when I was growing up live, and even as recent as seeing Derren Brown's first live show, which was back in 2000, I think, or maybe even just before then. A good sized theatre, but not a massive theatre in Bradford. I think St George's Hall it was maybe, and just been completely blown away. I'd never seen that kind of branch of magic or mentalism sort of performed in that kind of honest way that is sort of his brand now. And it's wonderful to see that stuff.
And I was jumping ahead to make a connection, but when you talk about the magic of seeing Ian McKellen do all those Shakespeare characters, you did a one-person Tempest, didn't you, David?
Oh, yeah.
Is that? Do you think that's the seed of it?
Yeah, I mean, I was very lucky in the high school I went to. They had a really strong theater program, and I was introduced to Shakespeare at a young age. Seeing Ian McKellen, and my parents were big fans of Shakespeare, and so there was this this competition, and I'm very competitive naturally. So
I just saw your eyes go staring when you
yeah,
said
no, Nick knows it. I like about anything.
Oh,
I'm
yeah.
intensely competitive. And I love games and sports and all that stuff. So anyway, there was this Shakespeare festival in Southern California. Of all the high schools in Southern California would compete against each other in two categories: an individual category where you would represent your school, or a scene, a group category of like 4 or 5 actors doing scenes from. Anyway, I cut together my own individual Tempest, where I played Prospero, Ariel, and Caliban, and I did this really physical thing that Nick would probably be genius at, but transforming yourself at different levels, Caliban on the ground, Ariel above, and Prospero, you know, whatever. And I ended up winning first place, and you know, in the competition. And the greatest moment of that I didn't know until you won was you get to repeat and do your scene again in front of all the schools on the main stage. And I think doing that at age like 14, you know, was hugely formative, because you know, it was just this big thing of approval. It was like you hope you're good, but when you win something like that, you feel like, oh, okay, I should maybe keep doing this.
Was there a
Because
particular teacher?
Others are enjoying it. So
sorry, and was there a particular teacher for drama at your school that this took off with?
Andy Grenier was my high school acting teacher that also later introduced me to Grotowski and a lot of
this
other.
Is a method, is it?
Yeah, very, very physical theater method and philosophy. And so that was hugely formative in terms of then bringing that to Northwestern and introducing a kind of, a different kind of style and process that would eventually lead to a formation of a whole theater company later. So
we'll come to university next, but I'm fascinated, Nick, as well, because teachers, or certainly a teacher, had an impact on you at school.
Yes, I sort of, it sort of got to the point now where I feel I should just name them, but I've kind of protected their identity till now. I mean, I'll be very honest, I don't even know if this person is still alive. You know, she taught us English when I was doing my GCSEs, so yeah, so we were like 15, but she left. I think she either went to a different school or something, but she left sort of halfway through our GCSEs, but she made an incredible impact. And partly because, I mean, she was genuinely such a character, and it is, you know, it informed the character that I often do on stage, Mr. Swallow, which is just this opinionated, quite camp individual with sort of huge, effectively, she was sort of using her position as a teacher as a platform to just spout views about literally kind of anything and everything. And, you know,
it's a bit Miss Jean Brodie. I mean, there's a long heritage, isn't there?
Yeah, and I remember, you know, some of the stuff. She once walked into the classroom and was like, "Right, we're going to do a debate," and you know, sort of, we're meant to be doing sort of English language or something, and it was like, oh, okay, and you know, she wanted to do a whole debate about capital punishment, and she was a strong advocate for capital punishment, and we were sat there even at that age thinking, well, I think the debates may be slightly more nuanced than that, and she, you know, she would have a go at us if we disagreed with her point of view, but she just had this sort of amazing sort of attitude. And I don't know, I just sort of ended up using sort of doing impressions of her at school, and it kind of sort of, as I became a student and started doing comedy gigs and so on, it kind of crept into my repertoire or whatever. You know, I just started doing that voice for comic effect. And so, yeah, she was an incredible inspiration, but I shouldn't really name her because, you know, I don't know, she might not see it as an homage.
It'll be like that Carly Simon thing, you know, who is the person who's so vain? It's like, who is Mr. Swallow? And I want to ask you both, but Nick first, the role of university then, where you know, often people do really find their voice as performers. Nick, you went to Durham initially to read geophysics and then started a PhD in seismology, studying earthquakes at Cambridge. Mm-hmm. What happened at university in terms of you becoming, you know, the performer and the writer and the creative you are?
As much as I did, you know, a lot of magic when I was growing up, I still wasn't. I was kind of confident in one particular way, but I wasn't really I wasn't sort of experienced or kind of wise, and I didn't really know what I wanted to do. And and in some respects, I think academia can feel quite quite an easy option in that respect, because you're effectively told what to do. You know, I went through, you know, primary school, secondary school, did sixth form, and then, you know, I thought, well, I'll go to university, and then, you know, I kind of decided to do that PhD because I didn't really know where else to go, and sort of thought, well, I'll just keep on sort of doing what I have been doing. And whilst I was at Durham, I knew that I enjoyed comedy, and certainly seeing it and you know, listening to it and watching it on television and so on. And there was the student sort of comedy group was the Durham Review, and they only had auditions once a year, and I auditioned twice whilst at Durham and didn't get in. And so it didn't so much knock my confidence, but it just made me think, oh, well, maybe it's not really for me. But I still had kind of lots of ideas, and I did the odd little gig whilst in Durham. But it was when I went to Cambridge, and the Cambridge Footlights being, you know, the equivalent sort of student comedy group. What was brilliant about the Footlights, certainly then, was that they, I think even still now actually, but compared to Durham at the time, was that they did you know, review shows every 2 weeks as opposed to once a term. And, you know, you could effectively audition every 2 weeks. And so I just, you know, I remember thinking, well, you know, it just presented so many more opportunities. And I guess having had that period at Durham where I'd sort of been sort of frustrated at maybe not really having that outlet to sort of perform comedy, suddenly there was far more opportunities to do so at Cambridge, and it took off a little bit from there. Yeah.
Fantastic. What about for you, David? Because you did a theatre degree at Northwestern, and it struck me, because I was that generation who, you know, watched Friends from the beginning and watched, you know, all your films, and I was really struck with Intelligence, you know, the sitcom you've done together, how technically skilled you are. You know, there's timing, there's physical movement, there's little moments of expression. And I remember thinking, is that going back to the degree?
Yeah, it's going back. It's a combination of the degree at Northwestern and the training there, but also since I was 13 years old, every opportunity I had to take extracurricular theater and summer camp and training, I took. So whether it's clown school, or I went to the British America Drama Academy at Oxford, where Brian Cox and Rosemary Harris were two of my teachers. So, and there was, I always was fascinated with the physical comedy and the kind of the training and the dance and the movement that really went hand in hand with it. So I tried to train everything and just acquire as many skills as I could, and stage combat, everything. You know, Northwestern really provided a really strong foundation there, as well as these other supplemental opportunities.
I feel I've been waiting 25 years to ask you if you had done something like clown school. Just as I say, even in Intelligence, the way that you throw yourself across a desk, but it's a fall and it looks like an accident. I just find that kind of physical ability, it's not something some people ever learn, and you were trained in it years ago.
Yeah, and I kind of developed my own process. So because it really is, for me, it's quite specific, quite choreographed. And because in order to do it over and over again, you want to not be hurt every time you do it. So you want to, but you have to sell it, as Nick knows, you have to sell it in a way, whether it's stage combat, the same thing. No one ever wants to actually get hurt. So it's just practice. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned they're not getting hurt, because I thought as one gets older as well, it really matters to do that well.
What are you saying?
Give me that look. So there's a moment when you're both in the same country, which is, David, did you bring a university show to Edinburgh Fringe Festival?
Yeah, yeah. So at Northwestern, I had always directed. Even in high school, I was directing. And when I got to Northwestern, I really wanted to direct this one very physical production, again, kind of based in Grotowski, but this adult version of Alice in Wonderland, in which 6 actors transformed themselves and played every character in the 2 books, Alice in Wonderland and Through the Looking Glass, with only one actress playing Alice the entire time.
When you said adult, I misunderstood for a moment.
Well, it's kind of a grown-up, sophisticated version of the adaptation of the 2 books combined. And it was first done by Andre Gregory and the Manhattan Project in, I think, the 70s. But I really wanted to do this and direct it at Northwestern, but I was told I hadn't taken the requisite directing course with this one director who I just hated his work. I just thought he was trash. So I thought, this is completely illogical. Why do I have to take directing? Why do I have to study directing from him? I've been directing, I was very full of myself, but I'd been directing since I was 13. I don't like his work. I don't see why I have to do this. So, but they refused to give me a space or support me directing this play. I said, fine, I'll use my bar mitzvah money, which I had saved. And I produced it. I found a theater off campus and I cast the show among, actors that I loved and respected. And I just produced it off campus. It became a really big hit and kind of like the hot thing to see, off campus. And it was successful on top of that. And I produced it as well as directed it, and I made money. And I was like, okay. So I, being pretty, as we've established, arrogant and full, big-headed, I went to the dean of the School of Speech and I said, hey, I just produced this play off campus. I've heard about this international theater festival in Scotland called the Edinburgh Festival. And I think you should send me and the cast to Edinburgh, to the festival, to represent Northwestern and the city of Chicago. Like that. I was so, I was 20 years old. I didn't know what, but to his credit, he said to me, how much does it cost? And I'd done the budget. It was $10,000. And he said, if you raise half of it, I'll match it. And I was like, done. And so I got in touch with Second City, and they gave me their space for free. And I produced
this is the famous comedy club in Chicago.
Yeah, and I produced a shortened version, like benefit performance, to send us to Scotland. And sure enough, we raised $5,000, and he kept his word. And that summer, we were in the Edinburgh Fringe Festival, where I got to see Stephen Berkoff's play West the first time it was produced. And that play blew my mind. And I then spent the next 10 years trying to produce that in Chicago with my company, which he finally granted us the rights to do. But
this is the Looking Glass company that you set up, and which is still, of course, going.
But that experience of producing, going, traveling to that festival, seeing all that theater from all over the world and particularly all over the UK, the comedy, seeing everything, and producing it successfully, like, again, was one of those formative events that told me, oh, just keep doing what you're doing. So.
Do you know what is also interesting, Nick, thinking, we know, and you would know, that Edinburgh Fringe is a kind of rite of passage for anyone who wants to have a comedy career. And it's fascinating to see someone coming from, the States, and it also becoming it's almost like a station that you went through it as well, presumably. With the Footlights, at least.
Very much so. Yeah, the first time I went there was with the Footlights, and that was back in 2004. And then the following
many times over the years.
And then the following years I went every year. I sort of then started doing every other year, 10, 12, 14, 16, 18. But it's 2012. I'm not that old. 18, 12, 18, 14, 18. But yeah, I mean, you're right. It's sort of where there's almost an etiquette, isn't there? That if you want to pursue comedy, it's where, you absolutely go there to road test your material. It's the industry pretty much heads up to Edinburgh over August. Obviously not at the moment, sadly, but hopefully, if not this year, next year, it'll all kind of be coming back again. And it's where you showcase your year's worth of material, and the whole industry heads up there to see what you're doing and what you've done. And
can I say, Nick, you were robbed for at least a couple of nominations. I mean, I was reading all the reviews of your shows that you've taken to Edinburgh, and everyone was talking about you. And I don't know, has it been frustrating that perhaps Edinburgh didn't give you the kind of break that some people have had when they've won, what used to be the Perrier, say?
I think, I try not to. I try not to kind of really get too concerned by those things. I mean, there are so many ways in which you can, I guess, sort of have benchmarks in terms of how well you feel you're doing in Edinburgh, and whether that's to do with ticket sales, or whether you're proud of the show, or whether your parents have liked it, or the press that you might get.
Critics liked you. They raved about you, and they said, "Why aren't you on the shortlist?"
Well, I get, and again, you got to try and take some of that with a pinch of salt. But yeah, listen, I was just. It's always nice to do a show where, there's nothing more, having more recently done more TV comedy, there's something absolutely sort of delicious about doing something which feels quite frontline, when you kind of put yourself on stage and you get that absolute immediate response from an audience, and there is nowhere to hide, and you have to take, I guess, you know, the highs and lows. There's no one else you can blame apart from yourself. And with TV, you know, there is a process, there are scripts, there are other people who will, you know, who will want input into those scripts, and then there's the process of filming and an edit. Whereas on stage, you go on, and of course you prepare your material, but you go on there and you know immediately if the audience like you or don't. And when an audience do, it's like no other feeling. And you know, that is worth far more than, you know, any press or award nomination, I think.